So I work for a group called the Mobilization Lab, for those of you that have never heard of it. We're kind of a think and do tank within Greenpeace. We probably, if you've seen anything, you might have seen some of our content. We do a lot of capturing of campaigns and case studies. We do some think pieces and guides, trying to fill kind of some of the gaps we see in terms of documenting current best practice. But essentially, our role in the organization is more about transformation within the organization, so that we're transforming the way that we run campaigns. Of course. I'll speak louder. I'll try. So a lot of what we do is about organizational transformation. So transforming the way that we plan and run campaigns so that we can win bigger and put people at the center. And that is really how I came to design thinking, or human-centered design. You have maybe heard some stuff about design thinking. Who's here has heard of it? Cool. Who was at my session last year? Nobody. Okay, I was going to say this is like a continuation, but I'll get into that. So yeah, there's been a lot, particularly in the business press, about design thinking. It's being increasingly used by development NGOs, by governments, local governments, and you even have things like, I know the US Department of Aid is starting to insist on development organizations they work with to use this process. That's a whole other political issue, which we won't get into now. But there's been a lot of hype about it. And this quote that was taken from the Harvard Business Review did this whole issue on design thinking last September. And in one of the articles, this guy from Blackboard said that a lot of the reasons people are using it is about cultural transformation. And that's really the reason I got into it, I would say, because I was getting frustrated with the way, or the lack of collaboration that was happening in planning teams or in project teams. And so that's how I first got into it as well. For those of you who haven't heard of it, it's based on traditional design practices. And when I say design, I mean problem solving. I wrote a whole thesis about it if you want to read it. And one of the biggest proponents of design thinking is the group IDEO. They do both a for-profit version and a non-for-profit version. And they describe design thinking as the intersection between business viability, desirability, so human desirability, and technical feasibility. And they say the intersection of those three things is innovation. And I like to kind of think of it from a NGO campaigning perspective as that viability being about the ability for the project to change something, to change and meet our mission. And do we have the resources, skills, and that we need to do that? So it's a lot about empathy. So some other big names in the design thinking world are Tom and David Kelly. They're brothers. One works at Stanford. The other one works for, I think, IDEO as well. You're nodding, so I'm going with that. And they describe it as about empathy and creativity and rationality. I think there's one really important thing missing from that, which is about prototyping and iteration, taking risks, and a high tolerance for failure. So a high tolerance for failure is built into this process. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really attractive to me working in an NGO. So what I did for about 6 months was I embedded with our office in Mexico City. They had an executive director who had studied this before. I was doing my master's on this, and she invited me to come and play in their office for 6 months. And I kind of had free reign with the teams to get them to do whatever I wanted. It was kind of great. I could ask them to do anything. So I worked with 3 different projects out of our Mexico office. The first one was around toxic chemicals. Second one was around food and agriculture. And the third one was around urbanization and sustainable urban development. And so what I'm going to present today is kind of the final conclusions of what we came to after that like kind of 6-month deep pilot. But it was a journey along the way in terms of learning how to adapt this for a campaigning environment. And I'll tell you where we got to at the end as well. So the main principles for design thinking is it's human-centered, and that's why we wanted to use it, because at the Mob Lab we're trying to increase our ability to win with people, right, and put people at the center of our campaign. So the process is very people-centric. It's also solution-focused, so you're trying to develop a solution. I think a lot of the times in NGOs we get stuck on the problem and fighting the problem, and so this is a very solution-focused process. It's also mindful of process. There is a process, there are lots of different processes, and it can be a cyclical process, but the important thing is to know where you are in that process. It's action-based, which is why I loved it. It's very practical, right? So it's not a lot of theory, it's very practical. The culture of prototyping, I'll talk about that more later, and radical collaboration, and that was really my entry point into it, in terms of collaboration with teams. This is an example of one of the processes. This comes from the D School, the Stanford D School in California. They were the first university to start teaching this as a degree, and they have a cross-departmental approach to it. So they bring in people from engineering, they bring in people from psychology, they bring in people from design, and they work together as teams. And so they'll have a challenge, and then they go out and empathize with the people they're trying to reach. Then they come back and define what problem they're trying to solve. They go through a creative process, prototyping, and testing. And what we were trying to do was blend this with a campaigning approach. So this is the Greenpeace, this comes from a Greenpeace training about campaigning as the campaign cycle. It's really tiny text. So it starts with what is the problem, what are we trying to achieve, and it probably looks fairly similar to what your campaigning processes are. So we were trying to blend the human-centered design approach with our campaign planning. And what we came up with looks something like this. Different than the D School process, because we're a mission-based organization and we have a challenge that we want to solve. And so we need to start off with what are we trying to achieve, really. And a lot of the time, other design thinking processes start much more with what do people want and need, rather than kind of what are we trying to achieve. And so in order to blend this with a more campaigning approach, we did make some changes. And we changed some names as well. What you'll see is if you're working with agencies, they probably are closer to this process because they're starting with a client brief. And the client comes to them saying, I want to achieve something. So this is the process we developed over 6 months. It's not a linear process. I know I've kind of introduced it here as a linear process, but it's a bit messier than that. So in terms of starting with defining our challenge, this is really where we started to blend some of the traditional campaign tools with this process. But we did it still with the principles of human-centered design in mind. So it's highly collaborative, right? So instead of having a group of experts go off and develop the strategy, we'll do it with a room of 20, well, 20 is large, usually 10, 12 people. And we do it in a very collaborative, visual way. And we use lots of different tools for that. This is one I stole from Nesta. They've got a great DIY toolkit online. I think this is better than our tool for exploring the problem because it really forces you to think deeply about what are some of the causes. And then you can see from the image there, we'll spend time with Post-it notes and talking about it and going as deep as we can to understand what is really underneath that problem. We also do some visioning. We're starting to move away from things like traditional power maps and look at system maps, but these are all collaborative. And that's really where I think my frustration used to be in the past was we'd have the experts doing the strategy, the campaign experts doing the strategy, the digital experts doing the engagement strategy, the fundraisers doing the fundraising strategy. And in this process, we bring all of them together for the whole process. So the whole team's involved every step of the way. We also created some new tools, which kind of still in beta. This is something we created called the Campaign Canvas. And we wanted to have something that we could create like a snapshot of the entire project in a really quick visual way that could also be constantly changed. So as we learn more, we're updating it and adapting it and adding to it. And really, so by the end of that challenge process, we want to have an idea of what our top line strategies are and who are our potential audiences. So we will probably have filled out boxes 1 through 6 at that point and kind of at least have a draft, right? And so we always take this approach that this is a draft and we're going to learn more as we go along, and these things might change. And that's why we wanted to have this like giant poster-sized version of the campaign project up on the wall that we can be constantly changing things. And then we move into something that we've called sensing. D-School calls it empathize. IDEO calls it inspiration. It's called all these different things all over the sector. And so it's a couple of things. One, I think one of the most important things is, and important for us, is empathizing with those target audiences, really understanding them in a very personal way. And it's also looking at what trends are going on. So what do we see going on in the world, both social trends or technology trends. And it also is to provide some inspiration for the creative part. And so we use different tools. The first thing we usually start off doing is defining our audience a little better. Even this little template has evolved quite a bit since then. So we are looking at tech workers as part of an ICT, Information Communications Technology Detox project. One of our projects, anyways. We wanted to reach out to tech workers, and the team in Mexico sat down and imagined a typical tech worker, and it's probably a little bit unkind. Single, I think. Looking for love. Nerd, not very social. It's probably not very kind. But then we went to a mobile festival in Mexico City. We talked to a bunch of tech workers, and we spent an afternoon at this little festival talking to many tech workers and really getting to know them. And so they went out in pairs. I think we went with 10 people, and each pair went out, and you had a note taker and someone interviewing, and they spent about 30, 40 minutes with each of these people, really getting to know them quite personally in terms of their motivations, what they think about the environment, what they think about the technology sector. So really understanding their motivations or barriers to action and what drives them. And then we took over a Starbucks across the road and captured all of these interviews. There are more than those Post-it notes, but we captured them all and then started looking at what are some of the key things coming up in those interviews and underlying themes and really sort of deep insights that we were beginning to have about these people, and then translated them into some very rough insights. Things like they really believe technology can make the world better, or they lack opportunities or resources to innovate, but they want to be involved in innovation. And some of their heroes are people like, or like companies like Tesla. And from those insights, then what we do is we take them and we spend a bit of time crafting what we call a focus question. So in this case, it was how might we inspire and involve tech workers to co-create digital products or platforms that raise awareness about the scale and impacts of e-waste in Mexico. So one of the things they wanted to deal with was, I think Mexicans buy a new phone on average every 8 months or something like that. So there's a huge tech problem, e-waste issue going on in Mexico, and they're manufacturing there, and then the government was like giving away 1 million new TVs and the digital switchover, and so a huge e-waste problem. So we wanted to see how could we involve tech workers in that, based on what they said in terms of their lack of opportunities for innovation and working together. And then we take it into a creative process. So that question becomes our starting point for a creative process to come up with ideas or a creative concept of what is this project going to look like? What will people do? And there are a few elements to that. First thing is it's based on some creative principles. And so we go through exercises to kind of instill creative principles with people, right? And so there are things like quantity is a condition for quality, and that's maybe even the most important one. You're not going to come up with your most innovative or creative or unique ideas in the first few ideas you have. And we have an exercise that I think everyone in the entire organization is now sick of called the Apple exercise, which kind of gets that point across. And we have different exercises that get some of these different principles across, because people really need to experience them. It's not enough to just kind of put them on the board and say, these are the creative principles. So some creative principles that we instill, let's say, in people. And then we use a structured process for developing ideas. Can I stand up? So if you think about it like this, it starts off with opening up. So many ideas as we can. And this is the really creative bit. And then you're closing down, selecting some of those. And then the few that you select, you open up again. So I can't really read the writing. You open up again, and then you're going to develop those few ideas. And then you make them into something concrete. And the reason we use a structured process is because then everyone is in the same place at the same time. So it's very hard to be in a brainstorm if you're trying to be really creative and someone else is going, oh, that's a shit idea. That's terrible, right? So we use this converging and diverging process to separate analytical thinking from creative thinking. And we use lots of different methods for that. So we'll, first get people to get all their ordinary ideas out, and then we'll use different exercises and methods that really push people out of the ordinary. So it might be photos that we're using to prompt new ideas, or we do something like a mashup, putting different ideas together. So we have a number of different processes that we'll go through to create new ideas. And yes, we do use a lot of Post-it notes. A lot. And then we've also used it for co-creation. So I'm going to go to co-creation after this, because we've used this a lot to co-create with communities as well. So, and one of our projects that was working on outdoor clothing brands, we did a training with a bunch of the volunteer coordinators in that project team. And then they went out and co-created ideas with mountaineering communities or other volunteering groups. Or, even I think we had some clothing industry people working with us. They did this across 11 countries over a month and a half. So, and it was probably the biggest co-creation we've ever done globally in terms of working with communities, which is great. And it meant that, we are, rolling out that training to different offices, getting ideas from people, but also beginning to understand that audience as well. So co-creation is another way to get insight into the audience you want to reach, because they're coming up with the ideas and what appeals to them and what they want to do. And it was also very empowering for all of these groups. And we had then mountaineers climbing Patagonia for us in like old-fashioned gear, not Patagonia clothing, but climbing the mountains of Patagonia in like climbing gear from, I think, the 1940s or something like that, right? So to prove it could be done. And then we move into a phase about prototyping. So those ideas that we've got, there might just be some nuggets of some creative concepts and ideas about what we want people to do. We prototype them. When I say prototype, I mean like really, really rough prototypes. These are examples of our prototypes. So for us, a prototype is really just a quick and early model of an idea, and it's some way of interacting with the audiences that we want to reach. So it might be a little storyboard done in Stickman. I've seen worse ones than these. And they still manage to convey ideas. And what's been really interesting is it doesn't actually, the quality of the prototypes don't really matter. I mean, I've seen prototypes go to the Mexico office where we had an illustrator in the team drawing these beautiful things, another group drawing like stickmen, and that came back unanimously said, yeah, the stickman idea was the one that everyone loved, right? Like, because it was more about the idea and the concept and the story than the quality of the prototypes. So the process for prototyping is really, we start with that idea, we do some rough sketches, we might even critique each other's sketches first to do a little bit of an internal improvement, and then we go out and we get some feedback from our audiences, and we might even redraw along the way, and I keep encouraging teams to like take some paper and pens and re-sketch while you're out there. I don't think they ever do. And then we come back and we kind of debrief on all the feedback. We always try to test the prototypes against each other so that we can get some relative comparison from the audiences so they can tell us what they prefer rather than us really trying to interpret their feedback. And then we might keep doing that a bit more. But one of the things I really love about prototyping in a campaigning organization is that it takes all of that internal debate and discussion and argument about like what we like out of our hands, and people come back with really clear ideas of what's going to work for audiences. And it's so cheap, paper, pens, quite quick. We usually do mock-ups in like half an hour, 40 minutes, and spend a couple hours out talking to people. So it's pretty quick. So cost effective, you get immediate feedback from your audiences, and it makes that discussion about how you're going to move forward so quick, right? In terms of Takes all this subjectivity out of the team in terms of people's pet projects, right? So really useful in that sense. I will show you some other prototypes. These ones were a little bit better, but we still only probably spent half an hour on them, grabbing some photos off of Google Images. And so this was with the tech workers ones, and one of their ideas was about connecting different tech workers to work on different projects. And another one was about, do you want to be the next Steve Jobs, right? Could you be a tech innovator in the sustainable tech industry? And we went to an open hack night in Mexico City. We just found it on the internet and went along and said, can we ask people about these things? They said, sure. So we presented our prototypes just on an iPad and came back with some feedback, right? And so, tech workers saying, yeah, I totally click on that, but maybe not if it was Steve Jobs. Maybe if it was like Elon Musk, I'd be much more into it, right? So really useful feedback that not all tech workers have the same heroes. But we got some immediate feedback from them about what would work for them. And it's really tiny. Oh, I can read it up here. So yeah, they weren't completely convinced about Steve Jobs, and they like, Apple is it's a different thing. It's about design. And then on the talent funding one thing, they thought it's a very cool idea. They wanted recognition was an important thing. How would we recognize their contribution to creating platforms? We got some really useful feedback about that. And then we decided, well, yeah, this is going to be a really big project for our short test in December. So then we went back out and did some more co-creation with people. And we didn't actually test these, but they might come in later this year. And then what we do is we wrap it up all into some sort of a plan. And again, this is a very collaborative way of putting that plan together. We're creating timelines. We do some great team building exercises, because a lot of this is then about how our team's going to implement it, right? How are they going to work together? And what we've done after our kind of 3 pilots is we've now turned this into a 5-day process. So the first project that we did last autumn, we did in 3 months. The second one, we did it in 2 months. The third one we did in 5 days. And for us, the reason that we went through this was, the first 2 projects were very much just about learning, but it was clear it was unsustainable for us, first of all, to be spending 6 months with each of our offices. But also, one of the biggest complaints we hear from senior management in the organization is that planning takes too long, right? So A, it's siloed, B, it takes too long. It's not very creative. It's all kinds of complaints. So we decided to try it as a 5-day process and run it with the final project in the Mexico office. And we did it in 5 days. It was intense. And I say that right now we're rolling this process out globally. So my colleague Michael is now in Brazil doing the 5 days with our food and agriculture team in Brazil. And next month I'm going to Manila. So we're going to keep continuing this 5-day process and learning and iterating on it. It's still a prototype. So what did we learn? I think the most valuable thing, and certainly the most valuable thing that the Mexican team came back with, was just getting out and talking to people. Oh my God, blew people's minds, right? Like just getting out from behind the desk, challenging some of the assumptions they had about the people we were trying to reach, kind of blew their minds. We did a little test in Shanghai with our global detox team, and we just sent them out for 2 hours on the streets of Shanghai when we were like going, are people even going to talk to us in Shanghai? It's a bunch of foreigners going out. And one of the women came back from our science unit saying, oh my God, we really don't understand our audience. And just from a little bit of interaction with the people we think we're trying to engage, you start to understand who they are and how little we know. One of the other things is I think there's a huge fear of failure in the organization. I'm sure in NGOs, everyone's afraid of wasting money, failing, not achieving our mission. And I think it means we tend to stick to the things we know are going to work because we're afraid to take risks. And one of the things about this process that the team really found is it kind of freed them to take some risks, because a prototype is just a piece of paper and a conversation with someone, right? So they felt more comfortable trying things that they wouldn't normally try because they went out, there was very low risk in trying them, going out and prototyping it, testing it, getting some feedback, prototyping again. So it minimizes the risks and it frees people up a little bit more to try things and experiment. So that culture of prototyping, I think, was really important for pushing us to do things differently. So team collaboration, as I said, was how I got into it. I mean, in Greenpeace, it's, we have specialists for everything, and they tend to do their specialist area, and they don't work much together. And so what was interesting about the Mexico team at the end of our evaluation on that first project in December is they said they couldn't tell the difference between who did what in the team, right? Like if everybody was doing it together. And so it didn't really matter that you were the digital person and you're the fundraiser and you're the campaigner. Everyone was doing the same things and they were doing it together and focusing on the big picture. And then when it came time for them to do their individual jobs and output, there was that people let each other get on with it, right? Like there wasn't so much micromanaging of, oh, this color on the website should be this and this font, and because they were focused on the big picture and had been working together and understood where they're going together. So when it came to output, people really just stood back and let each other get on with their jobs. And then I think the other thing is about, and that's probably true for you guys too, I mean, if we're trying to reach new people, I'm almost done. If we're trying to reach new people, then how are we going to do that if we don't empathize with them or understand them, right? We've done a lot of work in Greenpeace with values. Has anyone else here been working with values-based work? Anyone? Dirk? A couple. So we've done a lot of work with values, and I see the value in working with values. I think one of the things we've struggled with in the past on the value stuff is we still don't really understand the people. Like we might understand them in a theoretical way, but we either don't understand them on the issue, and we certainly don't empathize with them as like a human being. We kind of think of them as a faceless audience who has some values that we think they are this and they might like this, but we don't really, it gets a bit confusing and very theoretical. And so the advantage of this is really going out and talking to those people. And we've done values research in Mexico, and what I could see was there's definitely a correlation in terms of, okay, I can see that this really does correlate to the population values, but you miss some of the depth and the nuance if you're not going out and talking to people about the issue, that specific issue you're working on. Anyways, those are what I think it brought to us and real benefits of doing this. There were definitely some challenges, but I think the challenges were all internal. Like they weren't really to do with the process, they're much more to do with how we as an organization work. We're very problem-focused and analytical, and that means we approach it from sometimes, especially us, Greenpeace, a bit more of a confrontational point of view, right? Like looking at the problem and who are the big players and how are we going to change those people, rather than taking a wider view of what's the solution and how can we insert the solution, rather than kind of just trying to fix the problem. I'm not sure if that makes sense. It also required learning new ways of working, really did, and new ways of working together. I mean, I think it took some time, but I think that was also where people saw the biggest personal benefit, and it was challenging. But we're not really set up as an organization to do that, because our capacity is geared towards getting stuff out the door. And so asking people to spend a couple of days just in a planning workshop to come up with creative ideas and go and talk to people was really difficult. Like that first project, we could only grab a few hours a week from each team member because they had to get this out the door and that out the door. So the way we're structured is very much just geared towards output rather than the whole bringing people together and taking them through a whole process. And of course, there's a lack of experience in this method, and it is a skill that needs to be developed over time. So, that brought its own challenges. And I think as an organization, we're also quite inflexible to seize on opportunities or adapt to this process. So I don't know about you guys, but we have a calendar, and we have this is our priority project this time, and you have access to all the channels, and then this is our priority project, and you have access to all the channels. So if you're trying something and prototyping and you want to test a little bit bigger, like test on Facebook or online and to see if it's working at all, they're going, oh no, you can't for another 2 months because it's somebody else's turn on the social media channels, right? So a little bit of a lack of flexibility to integrate this into our bigger channels. And then also if we're in a process and we've just found this isn't working, and they're going, but you have to launch by this date, right? You're pushing something you know isn't ready. So just all of the challenges are really structural and capacity and process. There are some limitations to the process itself. Something I just kind of go back and forth on is that this is a product and service-based process. So it's primarily used for commercials, products, and services. It's, I think, more successfully used in development organizations because they're providing services to communities, or products even to communities. It's a little bit harder in a campaigning world where what you're trying to deliver, what you're trying to do is engage people in something or meet an emotional need, or, so it's not a practical need that people have. So some of the tools and exercises and techniques don't really work unless you adapt them. And some I don't use at all, but you can go down this road of going, is this working? And so it does need adaptation, really. I think people who are proponents of this process are like evangelical about it, right? So you might end up excluding other really important issues like historical context or other social factors that you're not going to get just out of this process. So I think blending it with other, like your existing campaign planning process is quite important. There's also a lack of campaigning NGOs doing this. I've only come across a couple, right? So sharing knowledge and sharing those skills and learning from each other, it's a pretty small community. Although hopefully it'll be bigger after today. And that means there's also a lack of examples and evidence of this being used for campaigning, and also for systems change. We're really interested in how we could use this for systems change. And there's just very few examples of that out there. There's one really interesting one in Peru, but it's from a guy who's like a billionaire and hired IDEA to do this massive social project. That's not us. So finally, what are we doing next? Oh, maybe I should talk about results. So the results from this are still inconclusive, I would say. We're still trying it. I think what is conclusive is that the team thought this really helped them, right? So it improved the team culture, it improved team collaboration. The senior management team said it improved the quality and of the plans they were getting. But those projects are still being rolled out. So to say that yes, it had bigger engagement wins or bigger impact, we're still evaluating. So this is still a work in progress. What we're doing next, though, is we're going to continue to keep doing this for at least a while in that 5-day package. And what we're hoping that this year is we'll get through a number of other pilots. The first thing I think that we really need to do is the organization globally needs to recognize that we need a consistent process. I don't have one. And that in itself is a challenge. And then we need to demonstrate that this process has impact. And so it's still under, and then we want to get, the Mexican office has already agreed to adopt this process for all of their projects this year, but we want to kind of scale that up and look at other offices and campaign areas.